Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining today's weekly live stream. Today's topic that we're going to cover here today is digital transformations in mergers and acquisitions and private equity backed firms. So, as you know, every week we do these live discussions, live interviews with different guests. We're always talking about digital transformations and ERP implementations and that sort of thing. But rarely do we really dive in and focus on mergers and acquisitions, private equity backed firms. So, we're going to really hone in today on what it is that makes those types of projects differently, what you should be thinking about if you're a PE-backed firm, if you've gone through mergers and acquisitions, or even if you're just a high-growth company that's trying to figure out how to manage some of the nuances of digital transformation. This conversation is going to be perfect for you. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And many of our clients are M&A, are going through M&As and private equity back. So it'll be a great conversation here today. I'm going to introduce our guest here in just a moment. But before I do, a couple logistical things. One is this interview is part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. So by being here today, you're part of our live production of that podcast. This interview will get edited. We'll add some additional content to it, and we'll release it here in a couple weeks as part of our formal, polished version of the Transformation Ground Control podcast. So thanks for being here today. And then secondly, I would love to get audience questions. The reason we do these interviews live is so that we can get audience questions and hear from you. So would love to hear any questions you have, any comments you have. If you want to share your experiences, we'd love to hear from you here today. You can just drop your questions or comments in the chat wherever you're watching or listening here today, whether it's LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. You can drop those questions in the chat. My guest and I are keeping an eye here on the chat. I'll cherry pick some of the questions and pull them up here today. So be sure to drop those in the chat. And while I'm waiting for you to ask your questions, if you don't mind, just drop in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. We tend to draw a global audience, so it's always fun to see where everyone's joining from today. So if you don't mind, just drop in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. I'd love to hear from you. I, for example, am based here in Denver, Colorado here today, and I'll let my guest tell us where he's from today here in a moment. But again, today's topic, digital transformation and mergers and acquisitions and private equity. And joining me today is Deric Selchow from West Monroe Partners. Deric, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Eric. Great to join you on this topic today. I'm really excited. So Deric Selchow, Managing Director with a firm called West Monroe Partners. We're a middle market management and technology consulting firm. I have a couple different practice areas, but specifically I work within the financial management space. That's kind of all things back office, ERP, finance transformation, based in Minneapolis.
Great. Yeah, great to have you. And we've sort of circled the same circles within the industry, and you and I tend to see each other at industry conferences and whatnot, and that's how we've gotten to know each other. So great to have you finally on this podcast. This is your first time here, so thanks for being here today.
Absolutely.
So maybe before I jump into these questions I have for you about just general trends and mergers and acquisitions and private equity, before I get to that, tell us a little bit about just how did you end up in the space? Like, how did you end up focusing in, not only landing at West Monroe, but sort of honing in and focusing on M&A type of consulting that you do?
Yeah, great question. All my colleagues love this joke, but I'm a recovering accountant. So there's a recovery program for people in finance. It's called consulting. So started my career in corporate finance. And when I graduated undergrad, I'm not going to disclose the year, it'll show my age, but it was in the prior millennium. I double majored in finance and MIS, and all of my classmates looked at me with kind of a raised eyebrow, and they're like, "What are you going to do with that? Why can't you pick a lane? Either pick computer science or pick finance." I was like, "I don't know. They both interest me, and I think that there's like something to be made of technology plus finance, right?" And so, in one of my first roles in corporate finance, I was actually the liaison for our finance department to IT. In managing our ERP and our financial reporting systems. So I've always kind of kept a foot in both sides of the fence, and then was contacted by a recruiter a few years later saying, we're looking for an ERP consultant. And I was like, you can actually make a living like consulting on ERP systems? That's kind of weird, but interesting. So I took a leap and have never looked back. So spent 10 years implementing the Dynamics stack of ERP systems, and then one thing kind of led to another, got into a little bit of business intelligence and data warehousing, then met some folks that my client was going through a merger of themselves, and met some practitioners from West Monroe, and the rest is kind of history. And kind of fell into M&A consulting, but still with that focus on finance in the back office.
Yeah, really leveraging that core accounting foundation you built early on. Weird but interesting. That's a good way to describe our industry. Weird but industry, or weird but interesting. I'm going to start using that if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is a good way to describe it. Well, that's interesting. So, when you look at some of the work you've been doing over the last few years, and as you sort of look to the future here and where we are today as well, what are some of the general trends you're seeing in the M&A and private equity space, just in general?
Yeah, great question. I think if we just kind of rewind the clock to 2023, it was a little bit of an odd year for private equity, especially with, kind of higher than normal interest rates and still kind of coming out of the pandemic and all sorts of world events. The private equity environment kind of cooled for a little bit. And it turned everyone's focus not so much to just a single core asset purchase, standalone company and grow it, improve it, and sell it. There really had to be kind of a special case because in the world of higher interest rates, it meant the private equity firms were actually putting more equity in than debt to make the model work. And so when we look at some of those special cases, maybe it's a distressed asset, maybe it's a underperforming asset, or maybe it's a tuck into an existing portfolio company to try to make something greater than the sum of the parts, right, so to speak. And so that's kind of how we came out of 2023 with a lot of what I would call kind of a little bit not odd, but like just not your run-of-the-mill kind of M&A transactions. There had to be kind of a special factor in there. And how now coming into 2024, we're really seeing a significant uptick in a couple of areas. One is in residential services or just services in general. So whether it's HVAC, electrical, home improvement, solar, like all kinds of services businesses, because they are somewhat recession proof in a way. Everyone needs kind of those products, those repairs. A lot of domestic manufacturing, food and beverage. There's a lot of consolidation going on in food and beverage. But one of my favorite areas that we've really seen an uptick in is carve-outs. So just imagine a business unit, part of a larger, probably strategically owned business unit, being carved out and then purchased by either a portfolio company or a private equity firm to, again, try to value creation is kind of the name of the game, make something greater than the sum of the parts. So those are some of the trends we've been seeing lately. So the thing with carve-outs, they're complex, they're messy. That's what I thrive on.
Right.
And you have a very limited timeline to execute on those projects.
Yeah. I'm actually going to come back to that if you don't mind. I wasn't planning on asking you about that, but that's a good point of focus here in a second. But maybe before I ask you more about the carve out concept and how transformations might look different in a carve out situation. If we look at M&A sorts of situations in general, where a company has either gone out and acquired other companies and or merged with another company or companies, digital transformations are oftentimes a part of that value creation that you talk about. So I know in general, you and I have talked a lot about digital transformations and ERP projects in general. There's a lot of, best practices and lessons learned that you and I both have just from having done this for so long. But when you look at M&A types of environments or PE-backed firms in particular, how do digital transformations look different? Do they have different priorities, different challenges? How would you sort of compare and contrast that?
Yeah, great question. I think what it all really kind of comes back to is every acquisition or M&A deal begins with an investment thesis, from the sponsors, from the backers. And we like to kind of work with that investment thesis because that's the why. Why are they pursuing this asset? Why are they pursuing this merger or this carve out? Because that can really be the guiding light of, where they perceive that there's value in this asset or this transaction. And so we like to kind of use that as the springboard to kind of justify the why behind their digital transformation. because like just doing it because it's the right thing to do isn't really a good enough reason to undertake a kind of a massive transformation or a massive digital transformation. There's got to be a different why behind it, right? And it comes back to that value creation. And I know our industry is full of all sorts of jargon and terms like this, but by focusing on the value creation, by putting together a transformation program, that really also helps the stakeholders at this company that's going to go through this transition, helps them stay aligned and focus on why are they pursuing this. And it helps really with the change management of getting everybody behind the idea, behind the reasons why they're pursuing this digital transformation. But I would say that another unique factor, specifically in the private equity world, is timelines. Timelines are not infinite in this world. There's a hold period, and you typically need to get some of these bigger initiatives done within a prescribed hold period so that you're not mid-flight with, kind of the change or the chaos if you're going to go through another M&A event, right? So time is of the essence. And then these firms also have a business to run. They don't want to be going through a perpetual implementation that's just kind of never ending. So it's an adjustment for some of us because we always want to do our best work and kind of like execute on the best project and have the best processes and everything else. Sometimes it means minimum viable product, and you plan for an optimization down the road. Sometimes you go with good enough or use what you have at your disposal. So it's different than just a typical project. There's other kind of constraining factors there.
Yeah. What about in the context of a PE firm or a PE firm that's involved that has an investment in a company, and their stated intent is to sort of create that value and flip the company and sell it in, say, 3 to 5 years? They're going to sell the company in 3 to 5 years. Does that influence like the type of technology you do or don't deploy, or the risk they're willing to take, knowing that they might sell the company to a parent company that uses a totally different technology or something like that? Like, how do you address that or navigate that reality in a PE situation?
Yeah. In some cases in our world, you really have to kind of get your magic 8-ball out and or your oracle or whatever term you're going to use, and try to predict the future. Because the other thing that we do know about this space is that these portfolio companies that we begin working with are unlikely to remain static. They're going to probably, in a 5-year hold period, tuck in 3, 4, 5 acquisitions maybe. Or maybe, sometimes the thesis is we're going to buy this asset, but we're actually going to split it into 2. And maybe one's a products business, one's a services business. And maybe that's the theory or the thesis, right? So everything kind of comes back to this thesis. So you have to try to get comfortable with kind of predicting the future and what might happen. And that really comes to life. We have a technique we use, like we build a playbook. And it's kind of somewhat the break glass in case of emergency type of playbook of, if this happens, then now we're going to follow this different workflow, right? Mm-hmm. And to your point, if the eventual exit plan is to go to a strategic, and we're specifically talking like about ERP, then let's just pretend that they're a manufacturer and we expect the exit to be a strategic buyer, and maybe they're in a kind of a regulated space like aerospace and defense or something like that. You're unlikely to go with the cream of the crop, top line, SAP, do it perfectly, every best tool off the shelf, because in all likelihood, if a firm like that's going to get acquired by a strategic, they're going to get rolled into parent company at the end of the hold period when that transaction goes through. So you don't really want to kind of gold plate everything, knowing they're eventually going to have to change again. So sometimes that's where you kind of pick the middle of the road and go with good enough in some cases, depending on what it is.
Good enough and easy enough to rip out and replace with something else.
Exactly.
The parent company might sort of impose on the acquisition. So just turning real quick to the audience, I want to thank those who've dropped in the chat where you're joining from today. I want to say hello to Darian in Denver on LinkedIn, David from Eastern Shore of Virginia in the U.S. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn. Naresh from Mumbai, India on YouTube. Thanks for being here. And then Zulfikar from India, Hyperbad India on LinkedIn. Thanks for being here today. And then we've got a good comment here from David on LinkedIn. He says, thank you guys for getting on and sharing your knowledge. Or actually, David's on YouTube. So thanks for joining. And thank you for being here today, David. And again, any questions you have as it relates to ERP implementations and digital transformations within a private equity merger and acquisition or high growth sort of situation, any questions you have, love to get to your questions here in just a moment. I'll keep asking mine in the meantime until we get some good audience questions. Now, you mentioned a moment ago, Deric, carve-outs. And, for those, maybe just for real quickly, for those that maybe don't know what a carve-out is, could you describe what a carve-out is and then maybe how that looks different in the world of digital transformation?
Sure. So basically, what a carve-out is imagine maybe a multi-product or multi-business unit organization. Maybe it has various product lines or various plants or locations. And that company has decided that, this particular product line or division is going to get carved out. Basically, you can imagine putting it in a box, and then that asset is going to be sold to a new buyer, whether they're a strategic, meaning another company, another corporation, or private equity, and be stood up on its own. So again, those all kind of start with kind of a thesis, meaning we are just wrapping up one that is a carve out of a brand within a larger kind of conglomerate, and it's going to be tucked into an existing platform company that has similar products. So it's going to become part of that other organization. Sometimes it's a carve out to standalone, meaning we carve the business unit out and make an entity, a company out of that carved out business unit, and they run standalone on their own. And how that typically comes to life from a digital transformation perspective is, depending on the terms of the carve out, the parent company might elect to, they all elect to write what's called a transition services agreement. So that's basically a contract that we will support you or support this business unit for X period of time while you get your house in order and stand up your own systems and your own processes. So the terms within that can mean, yes, we'll allow you to kind of clone the operational systems because they are running like a top right now and we don't want to disrupt anything, and we're amenable to like selling you our licenses for whatever platforms that we do have. And sometimes it's a completely, you need to figure it out, find your own tools, your own systems. You're not taking any of the tooling with you as part of the carve out. And sometimes it's a mix in between. And so that's really where our role comes in, is all of that kind of carve out planning of, okay, we don't get to take any of the tools with us. We get to take our data with us, of course, because that belongs to that asset. So we basically, in a 9 to 12 month period, need to build a company from scratch. And that's what I find was really fun about those types of transactions, is because you don't get many chances in your career to build a company from the ground up, but it's an established company. We can then take that chance to establish all the best practices, pick the best tooling, not the best ever, the best that's going to fit that business unit and get the transaction done in that period of that TSA arrangement.
Yeah. Yeah. If you imagine like a big multinational company that, let's just say they're running SAP, they're on S/4HANA, and now all of a sudden they take $1 billion of revenue in this one business unit, they're going to sell it off to someone else, just untangling that, from the assuming they implemented like a single system that spans the entire enterprise, untangling that and unwinding that and figuring out how you're going to let that company stand alone. I imagine that's a pretty challenging proposition.
It is. There's a lot of moving parts, and depending on the industry type, there could be regulatory considerations. There's sometimes, process considerations. If it's a highly engineered kind of manufacturing type of environment, there's a lot of operating technology that has to be kind of sorted out, and so it's not always just about ERP. But a lot of moving parts, and you got to get moving usually pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's a question from Darian, just building on something you mentioned a moment ago, Deric. This is from Darian on LinkedIn. She says, how do you see technology supporting these sorts of companies when compared to private equity firms? So, like, in other words, what are the main differences, would you say, in terms of how you use technology, the types of technology you use
Yep.
in these sorts of situations, that sort of thing? How would you sort of summarize those differences?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think some of the main differences is it comes in a couple different forms. There's a certain risk tolerance that's different between PE and I'll keep calling them strategics. A strategic meaning an established corporation of any type of ownership structure. There's a certain risk tolerance. There's a certain tolerance for, I would even say, kind of inefficiencies, right? If it's an existing strategic acquiring a business unit, they don't have the time pressure a lot of times to hurry up and execute on these transitions, and a lot of times we'll want to fold them into their existing operations that are very well established, probably have all kinds of SOPs and process documentation. But from a choice of technologies, again, when you're looking at a strategic versus a PE owned, there's probably less kind of going out to market to kind of choose the best solution. An established strategic buyer tends to have a lot of those things already kind of sorted out, already in their wheelhouse. Versus in a PE world, it's really, again, it comes back down to time and cost and value creation. So we tend to see a lot more, kind of software selections and kind of analyzing the best fit and kind of picking the best product to fit this kind of standalone entity versus going into an established environment where there's policies and procedures and a lot of that stuff established already. It doesn't really, I would say it doesn't really affect the technology itself, more so the plan and the strategy around these transitions that these companies are going through.
Yeah. With the exception maybe of what you were saying before about, using your magic 8 ball to figure out like what is likely to happen here and maybe not gold plating
Right.
the technology. In other words, you may not, I mentioned S/4HANA as an example a
Yes.
moment ago. You may not decide to go take on a big, complex, risky SAP project, knowing that you're just going to sell the company to someone else that may be using Oracle, in which case, that's not going to make a lot of sense. So I imagine that somehow influences your roadmap with it.
It does. And another real example, again, that we're just wrapping up. So it's this products company I was mentioning. They're carving out one of their product units. One of the divisions in the UK is using SAP, but ECC6, so legacy SAP. SAP, in fact, doesn't even want to sell licenses for that anymore.
Right.
It's really difficult to kind of execute on that. So we were faced with the question, do we clone? We have the ability to clone that ECC6 environment and just kind of let it operate and we deal with that on another day? Or do we take the time, effort, and possible disruption to merge them into an in-flight Dynamics 365 project that's going on at the acquiring company? It's a little bit of a Sophie's choice of like, well, which one's going to be worse? The SAP clone is going to cost a lot of money, but it'll be stable. Or do we, rip the Band-Aid off and incorporate them into this in-flight Dynamics implementation and hope for the best? So those are some of the questions and the analysis that we have to work through, because there's not an easy answer in any of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, what about the private equity firms themselves? I've worked with a few, just like you, and you guys work probably more with PE firms than we do. But in the experience I do have with PE firms, it's sort of all over the map in terms of expectations and their vision for how technology is going to fit into this acquisition or into this value creation. But how do they, just in general, how do PE firms view technology initiatives differently than the non-PE type of firm or the non-PE backed type of firm?
Yeah. Another good question, because and all PE firms are different. They don't all operate the same. So if you kind of think of it as on a continuum or on a spectrum, we've got some PE clients that are, you could almost argue, are just financial investors, right? They acquire an asset and they sit back and they're like, hey, management team, we bought you and we hired you for a reason because you're really good at running this company. Let us know if you need anything.
Right.
The other end of the spectrum, some PE firms will drop an operating partner or another staffer within the operations to, sort out their processes or digital transformation or other things, and actually hold a very active role within the organization. And then there's kind of everything in between. I think again, what a lot of the motivations come are the couple of factors we probably deal with in every project is time, resources, and cost, right? And finding that balance of, again, staying true to the investment thesis and the value creation thesis that was set out when they made the investment in that asset, and balancing that with doing a good job on your digital transformation, but not doing the best job buying the top of the line. And again, I think what every PE firm and probably even strategic wants to avoid is what I call the perpetual implementation, the implementation that's never finished, because there's always another phase or another delay or another work stream coming.
I imagine it's harder for a PE firm to sell a company when it's in the middle of an implementation that may not be going so great, or that's turning into a money pit or whatever. That's exact opposite of what I imagine a PE firm wants to see.
Yeah, because we and that's what our clients really value from our point of view, is that we do a lot of due diligence projects on behalf of our PE firms. And we look for a lot of those red flags of an in-flight ERP project during a transaction. It's not to say you can't do it, but you can imagine where we're going to spend our time looking to make sure that project is healthy, it's on track, it had good kind of reasoning behind why they're going through that transition. And so there's a lot of scrutiny if you are trying to go through a transaction while you're mid-flight on a project. In some cases, we work with our clients to advise them on, like, maybe they've acknowledged they have an incredible amount of technology debt. They have some legacy systems, they're on-prem, they're behind in patching. What we oftentimes would kind of rather see is we have a plan, and as soon as this transaction's done, we're ready to execute on the plan. And here's our plan. We're going to move to this system. We're going to address this issue. We're going to upgrade these systems. In some cases, that's more valuable than to be started on that transition, because depending on who the buyer is, they might have a different point of view, different opinion. And so now that might be kind of good money after bad, having started that transition only to have to course correct and go down a different path with the PE ownership.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Here's a really good question from Jordan on LinkedIn. Jordan says, how do you assess the digital maturity and readiness of a target company during an M&A process? And what strategies do you employ to ensure a seamless digital transformation post-acquisition to unlock value and drive growth? So basically, Jordan's asking you to give away the kings of the kingdom and just share everything you know about, about M&A. Just kidding.
We'll go through the diligence report.
But I love the digital maturity, especially like how you assess the digital maturity, and maybe you could start by describing when you look at digital maturity, what does that mean? And secondly, how do you assess that, or how does a PE firm assess that as part of looking at an acquisition target?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as part of our typical process, we look at all sorts of factors. And again, we've been talking a lot about ERP, but it really kind of covers the gamut all the way from, CRM systems and lead generation systems through ERP, operational technology. But we also have practitioners within our firm that really dig into the cyber infrastructure, email, file sharing, like all of those technologies. And that's essentially the basis of our diligence reports, is basically a digital maturity kind of assessment on where we see that things are good, we don't really need to disrupt, or maybe there's struggles in certain areas, or maybe there's patching or a security concern, and in some cases, this also involves people. We make an assessment of the staff at the target company, on, are they staffed appropriately? Is there a role that's missing? Is there some, maybe they have a blind spot within their organization, or maybe they're overstaffed, or maybe they are really a ripe candidate to go with a managed service provider rather than staffing up for various roles. So there's a whole formula and kind of analysis that we go through to really kind of assess that. And what's great about working with our private equity clients is they kind of keep us grounded and honest, rather than, and again, going into a diligence with the rose-colored glasses and saying, well, it's not perfect, and here's all the improvements we would make. We actually have to kind of like back up our recommendations with the why. So how does that support the investment thesis? How does that support where we want to take this company? And so that it's always a really good reminder as we're putting together kind of our best laid plans, kind of, again, reconciling that back to that investment thesis and the why we're even pursuing this particular transaction.
Yeah. Yeah. And building on that, I want to get to part two of Jordan's question here, which is really good too, which is, what strategies do you employ to ensure a seamless digital transformation post-acquisition to unlock value and drive growth? And I really want to hone in on that unlock value, drive growth. How do, and I think, if we back up for a second, even if you're not a PE-backed firm, I think this is something that a lot of organizations should be thinking more about, is how do you unlock value? How do you drive growth? It's not just PE firms. It's not just M&As that should be driving that. So maybe just in general, how do organizations do that? Or what are some of the strategies you've seen work best to unlock that value and drive the growth?
Yeah. So in fact, right before we started this conversation, just got off of a call with a client where it's not an M&A transaction. We're actually leading a massive business transformation. All kinds of change is going to be introduced in this organization. They have a lot of pain points. They have a lot of things they're working on. And the meeting we just wrapped up was putting together that benefits case of all of the whys. And it's basically, it was a series or an entire list of all of the potential measures, KPIs, and the improvements we intend to see to justify kicking off this business transformation. So it is part change management, because that's really kind of a change management type of thought process of kind of gathering the vision and values, right? The vision being the kind of the thesis, if you will, and the value meaning what value drivers are we going to measure to prove that this was a valuable transition to go through, right? So we're not so much coming up with the metrics right now. We're coming up, what are we going to measure? Now, next step, now that we're aligned on what we're going to measure, our next step is to say, how are we going to measure it current state? And then kind of snap that as the baseline. And then what are we going to measure, future state, and how do we measure it there? So it's really around kind of quantifying and measuring and tracking progress as we undertake all of these initiatives.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that's sound advice for a company that's not going through an M&A or that's not PE-backed or whatever. And I think, a lot of times I think if organizations could spend more time acting like they're PE-backed or acting like they're about to go through an acquisition, I think it might change their mindset of how they approach these sorts of projects. Because generally speaking, a PE-backed firm is going to cut out the waste. They're not going to waste a lot of time and money on an implementation. They're certainly not going to want to get into a money pit, and they're certainly not going to want to implement technology without creating value and that sort of thing. So I think that's a great mindset for any organization.
And it's really important too to just take the emotions and the brand affinities and all of these biases out of this process, right? And really get back to the metrics again. Not everything can be measured necessarily. Some of the benefits identified are a little bit more intrinsic, like improving user experience. Like, how do you really kind of measure that? But there are ways to measure that, or to gauge it, I should say. It's not necessarily scientific, but like there's a lot of kind of emotion and bias in projects that are this transformational, because it's like, well, I don't like Oracle. Like, I've heard that from clients who are like, we can do this, but it can't be an Oracle product, or it can't be an SAP product, because I have this preconceived notion on why, or I had a bad experience in my past. So, so there's a lot of those kind of non-measured reasons that we try to set by the wayside.
or I've got this buddy down the street that told
Yep.
me that Oracle sucks or whatever.
Yep.
You get these biases that do or don't always make sense, but it's good advice. Take the emotion and the bias out of it and just look from a pure strategy and KPI perspective. And you're probably going to end up on the right path. Are there certain types of technologies? I know we've been talking a lot about ERP in general, but if we just sort of back up and not just focus on ERP and just talk about enterprise technology in general, any sort of business technology that a company might be deploying, are there certain types of technologies you find more suitable for these higher growth and M&A and PE-backed companies?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. What I would say tends to be the norm, especially in a PE-backed company, is they shy away from the moonshots and the bleeding edge. They don't want to be the guinea pig, but they also don't want to be behind the times either, because that has a certain negative connotation as well. The next time they go through a transaction, you could be on 10-year-old technology and you thought it was the latest and greatest, but you're kind of seen as sort of behind the times. And the best example I can use is, and you probably had the same experience, 10 or more years ago, cloud computing was all the rage. I had so many CFOs tell me, no way over my dead body, my financial data is going to be in the cloud. I need to be able to keep my eyes on it and keep my hands around it. Well, that cloud has kind of, well, not to use a pun, but that
Right.
cloud has passed. Companies are a lot more comfortable. In fact, cloud computing has a lot of benefits to get you out of that kind of management and infrastructure game, which has its own risks associated with it. When you own it, you have to manage it, right? The infrastructure and the security patches and all of that sort of thing. And so now that we've kind of gotten through that cloud computing conversation, of course, the next one is AI. There's a lot of misunderstanding about AI. It's probably one of the biggest buzzwords in the last 18 months or 2 years. And there's both excitement, but also a little bit of trepidation, meaning, so we're just going to be dumping, our information into this model, and God knows where it's hosted or where that data is going or who's looking at it, or is it getting stored? Right. There's all those same kind of questions, but our clients are also kind of seeing the benefit of how that can really lighten the burden on a lot of these repetitive sort of tasks that their staff are really kind of going through, and also kind of highlighting insights in their data. I've seen a couple demos now of some AI applied to ERP systems where it's finding patterns that a human wouldn't know to go look for because of our own biases, right? Well, it's always this way. So I always look at these sales orders, and I always, the classic salesperson will say, that's our best customer. Yeah, but every product you sell them is at a negative margin. So are they your best customer? They're only your best customer because it's highest volume, but you lose money on every order you sell to them, just as an extreme example. But seeing this AI applied to these business transactions, it's highlighting insights that a human would probably take several hours to try to come to some of those conclusions. So it's not an end-all be-all, like it's going to solve world hunger and do all of these magical things, but it's a tool, and that's kind of how we treat it. AI is a tool that helps us do a better job, but it's not a replacement necessarily for anything. So I think that's kind of the latest in technology from these PE-owned firms. And then in addition, like if we're going to talk specifically maybe around manufacturing, it's kind of IoT on the shop floor or in a delivery vehicle or on device management, and kind of that real-time stream of information that you can start to gather from your operations.
Yeah. I just read an article last night. In fact, right before I went to bed, I'll read just to help me fall asleep. And I was reading Harvard Business Review, and there's an article about AI and how AI is not going to give companies competitive advantages, but AI is going to help companies that have existing competitive advantages just scale it up and become stronger in those areas. And I thought that was an interesting perspective and on their research that, it's not about using AI just to create some new advantage you don't already have. It's about, really doubling down on the ones you do have. So that's interesting. So when you look at implementations or just any sort of technology initiative within these environments, these M&A or PE-backed environments, what are some of the keys to success, and how does that look different than a company that's maybe not as high growth or that's not PE-backed?
Yeah. I would say, probably the number one consideration is timeline and a couple of factors. So timeline, not only of the project of we want to be done with this project, of course, I think
Right.
everyone wants to be done with a project, but it's timeline also of when are we going to start seeing the value, right? So the way that kind of comes to life in these projects, again, it comes back to that change control now, not from the organizational change management perspective, but change control from the scope and the design and the reason we're undertaking this project. So it kind of takes almost sort of like a ruthless PMO to make sure that the scope stays in scope, and the stakeholders don't start asking for things that are not a priority. So again, it goes all the way back to the beginning when the project kicked off, all aligning and agreeing to the scope, agreeing to the objective and the strategy behind it. So to not let all of those really distracting nice to haves kind of float their way in. And that's kind of an uncontrolled kind of change situation is what causes projects to be these perpetual implementations that I talk about, where you're plodding along and everything's tracking. Then you get into user acceptance testing, and if the folks helping with the user acceptance testing aren't aligned to the strategy and the objective, they're never going to find perfection in any of the tests, so they're going to fail them all, and then you're going to go back and rework. And a lot of the implementation consultants just want to do their best work and be responsive to their clients, so they'll make all kinds of changes and they'll test again and changes and test again. So there has to be leadership involved, and they all have to be aligned on what the goal line is and what we call a success, and decide to move on. And maybe it's something that can be addressed, in an optimization phase rather than in this initial phase. So getting it stood up, operating, because just as well as I do, in an implementation, we set out with all of these really good lofty goals on all the improvements that this new system's going to bring us. But we all know in that first kind of post go live, we're going to see a dip in productivity. We're going to see a dip in efficiency because we're all still getting used to this new system and a new way of working and all of these other things. But we need to kind of work as hard as we can to come out of that dip. But that dip happens in every single implementation project. It's just a known factor. Our clients find it uncomfortable to talk about. They're like, well, what do you mean we're going to be less efficient? We're going to say, initially out of the box, yes, you're going to be less efficient because you're still getting used to this new way of working. And that's really the factor, is that change factor is like, now my world looks different. It's going to get better, but we got to get used to working in this new platform, new system.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a good segue into another thread, which is change management. You talked about, people getting used to the technology and that sort of thing. Before I get into some of the more tactical change questions I have for you, just at a high level, when a company's PE backed or going through mergers and acquisitions, that's just a lot of change for an organization in general.
Yes.
Forget technology for a minute. It's just a lot's changing. We've got new ownership. We're probably reorganizing. We're probably changing processes. There's probably a culture shock because now all of a sudden we're focused on different metrics or whatever the case may be. What's the temperature of these organizations in general? I know everyone's different and it might vary wildly, but just in general, how would you summarize or generalize the temperature of an organization that you work with that is either PE backed or going through some merger or acquisition? Is it chaotic? Are people stressed out? Is it exciting? Like, how would you describe it?
Yeah, it really depends on the nature of where they are in their cycle. So the first example I'll use is a founder-owned business. He or she has grown it to such a level, and then now it's kind of time to cash their paycheck, so to speak, and sell to a buyer, whether it's PE or a strategic buyer. What we tend to see in a founder-owned organization where it was kind of scrappy, they built it themselves, they created this great organization, this great asset, there's quite the resistance to change, and they almost see it as, any suggestion of maybe a new platform, new system, or a different way of working is almost seen as an indictment of like, well, that's not what we used to do.
Right.
Because what we used to do like worked and it got us here. And we kind of have a turn of phrase that is, what got you here is not going to get you there, right?
Right.
There's a reason you're going through this transition, and it's to grow and scale. And so everything that you did to build this thus far has been great, but that doesn't scale. And let's chart the course together, right? That doesn't always go smoothly because there is a lot of pride of ownership. Now, contrast that with a firm maybe that's on their third PE ownership, third PE sponsor. They're like, oh, okay, I've seen this playbook before. I kind of know, I know how this works. I know what kind of the overall objectives are. And so there's a little bit more comfort in kind of knowing how these cycles work when they've been through kind of multiple transactions, multiple transitions. So what we tend to see to kind of address that first scenario with the founder own is to plug in some leadership and some staff that's been through, a private equity cycle before, to kind of build that knowledge base of what to expect when you're now owned by PE. And that tends to work really well because where we see it successful is when that person has been in the industry, but then so they have credibility. Otherwise, the walls go up, or like, oh, you're just a management consultant. Like, what do you even know how I run my business? But if they can find an industry operator that can kind of talk the talk with them, but then kind of guide them down the path of, how they're going to make life better and kind of chart that course, then that can allay a lot of those fears. But we don't always get granted with that benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine that, you might have a similar experience where you see those employees that, like you said, it got us to where we are today. And oftentimes what got us to where we are today is a series of heroics and dependency on tribal knowledge and things that are really like human-based values. So in other words,
Yeah.
if I have a crappy system and you don't give me any tools to do my job, but I somehow figure out how to do it and do it really well over the years, that's kudos to me, right? But the minute you start to bring in technology that's going to automate that and take that away from me, even though that's going to be better for the company, most likely, it's going to be a threat to me in the short term. So do you see that dynamic a lot where it's like, hey, I know the founder of the company. I was here from the very beginning and I helped us get here. And now all of a sudden this PE firm comes in, imposes all these new processes and technologies. And I could see that being a threat or sort of a short-term challenge for a lot of people within those organizations.
Yeah, I've seen that in practice where that said individual, friends with the founder or really close colleagues, decided, there's no ERP system commercially available that will fit our business, so I wrote our own.
Right.
Where, like, you had the best intentions, but a lot of times the advice we give those firms is like, you're not in a software development business. Like, you're a manufacturer or you're a distributor, right? So you don't have necessarily the software development skills to actually run a proper software development, organization, even though you felt that like you developed your own ERP system that's perfect for the way that you do business right now, right? And that's really kind of something that we are on the lookout for, is like, yeah, it's perfect for the right now, but it's not going to continue to scale and grow. And there's a real support risk, or a key person risk is the other thing that we tend to call out in diligence as well. Is there someone that's got all the knowledge trapped in their brain and like they hold the keys, and if anything happens to them, like, we're going to be really in trouble. That can happen even with commercial software, or like, as you probably know too, with integrations, right? They have a really complex kind of Byzantine kind of integration environment, and there's like one person that knows how to restart all the SQL jobs to keep making everything kind of run on time. That's a risk as well. It's all about kind of sharing that knowledge and taking that pressure off that person, because we've seen it in cases where that person hasn't had a vacation in 5 years because they're not allowed to leave or take a break.
Yeah, business will shut down or come to a screeching halt because that person went on vacation or decides to retire.
Yeah.
What about, so when a PE company or a parent company comes in to buy another company, usually they're doing it because they see some competitive advantage or some competitive differentiator in that
Yep.
acquisition target. So when you think about commercial off-the-shelf software, though, that's sort of a not a generic technology, but they're standard technologies that are accessible to anyone. So how do you balance that sort of standardizing using off-the-shelf software that any other competitor could use versus preserving that competitive advantage, whatever it is? Do you find a tension ever between that, like the standardization of off-the-shelf software sort of potentially diluting that competitive advantage versus that IT guy or gal that built that homegrown system that's specific to this company that helps them enable their competitive advantage? How do you find that balance between let's not be a software company, but also let's not completely dilute our competitive advantage? How do you navigate that?
Right. I think where we've had the most success with that is working really hard to get that, that person or that team that has this pride of ownership in this, said homegrown system, to use them as part of the process, meaning they have a lot of institutional knowledge about how things operate and how things work and where a lot of the value in a lot of their processes are. And so getting them on the team early to actually help with the requirements definition process is really, really important, because they're also the ones that can kind of help us find any gaps in some of these processes. And we can, if we're successful at it, really help them kind of see the future of, okay, in this one case, the process you're following might be inefficient. Maybe there's a different way of executing on that, but still getting the same result, right? But it really comes back down to kind of education and helping them kind of see the light, so to speak, with data and with evidence, and getting them comfortable with that process. But including them in the requirements definition, because they're a real asset to that whole process. No one, we had a term we used to use is, you don't want to have an ERP system done to you. We want it done with you, right? Because at the end of the day, all the consultants get to leave when the project's done, and you're going to be left there with the system to manage and with all the care and feeding.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Makes total sense. So what about PE-backed companies that are getting started on their digital transformations? What are some of the first steps that you typically advise clients on to kind of get started on their journeys if they're PE-backed and or going through a merger or acquisition?
Yeah. So after the transaction closes and they are now the owners, a lot of times what we'll do is kind of dust off our diligence report. Again, that was rooted in their investment thesis, and our advice in there is oftentimes kind of aligned to what they are hoping to do with this new acquisition. And we like to go back and kind of reconfirm the assumptions that were made in all of that. Has anything changed from an investment thesis perspective? What do they see on the horizon for possible tuck-in acquisitions? Various kind of factors like that, and work with them and the management team to kind of sit down and, one of the best things I like to do when we have the chance is actually walk through our diligence report with the management team. So in the transaction lifecycle, when we're going through a diligence, the diligence is a deliverable that we owe to the private equity firm. It doesn't belong to the target company being acquired necessarily. And in a well-run organization, after the transaction closes, the PE firm will sit down with the management team and kind of share the findings that came out of all the diligence providers, quality of earnings and legal and all of them. We really like to have that opportunity to kind of walk through our analysis and our justification with the management team. And again, part of it's a people part of the equation, to kind of get them kind of thinking the way that we put our advisory report together, to kind of help them on that journey. So we're not always just calling their baby ugly. We want to kind of walk through the reasoning and kind of show the receipts, if you will, to kind of justify where we're coming from. And that goes a long way to kind of getting them in the boat, so to speak, to get on board with what's being suggested. And then through that process, they may have even had some of their own, epiphanies, because they've probably been diligenced by 3, 4, 5 firms, all asking similar questions. And so the management teams that are paying attention are like, every one of these firms asked about why we have an out of support ERP system in the server closet, behind the reception desk.
Right.
That's probably an issue, since they all kind of like honed in on it and asked
Right.
questions for 30 minutes. That's probably an issue.
Right.
So the light bulb kind of goes off. But yeah, reviewing that advisory report with the management team is a really valuable exercise, so that they get a sense where we're coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And identifying where the risks are, and because those reports typically are showing why there's an interest in the company, but it's also showing what the concerns are, the risks, or the opportunities for value creation that maybe haven't been tapped into yet. So really understanding that upfront, I could see it sort of gives you a clear direction of where to go.
And the competitive nature too of it is these management teams and these companies, they like to know how they stack up against other companies. Like, how are we doing? It's almost kind of like a classroom environment, right? Like, how does our report card look versus the student sitting next to me? It's kind of a similar sort of competitive thing. It's like, how do we stack up? Like, where are we on that journey? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. 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 And I think, again, back to the point I made earlier, that your point we were talking about earlier is, even a non-PE backed company, if you could think that way, think about, how you might position yourself for a sale, or how you might maximize the value of your organization. That should be the guiding light for how you deploy technology. It's not, it's not because SAP told you you've got to get off ECC by 2027 or else they're going to stop support. That's not a good enough reason. I mean, that might be the impetus for why you go through the project, but you've got to take it a lot further than that and say, okay, well, let's think like a PE firm here now. Like, what do we do to manage risk? How are we going to manage cost, time, resources? What's the business value? What are the KPIs? What's the strategy? All that stuff.
Exactly.
And if you start going with that mentality, even if you're not PE backed, that's going to help tremendously. And I don't think enough companies do that, in my opinion.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Well, good stuff. How do people get a hold of you if you want to learn more about you personally and or West Monroe? What's the best way for us to get in touch with you?
Yeah, probably easiest is my LinkedIn. I'm not sure if we can include that in.
Yeah, we'll tag you. We'll tag you in the comments.
Tag me in the LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest. Otherwise, you can find me westmonroe.com. I do have a bio and a profile on the website. If you just search our website for my name, that'll get an email directly to me. Those are probably the two best routes.
Yep. And your name, I'll spell it out for people that might only be listening to the audio only version of this, but it's Deric Selchow. I said Selchow, which is actually how you spell it. So it's Deric, Deric, and then Selchow is Selchow. Hence the reason why I always mispronounce your name, Selchow. And so
it's okay.
I hope I'm not the first, but
you aren't the first, and you're not going to be the last.
Right. Well, good. Well, thanks for being here today, Deric. Great having you. This is a great conversation. Really appreciate you taking the time and sharing some of this great knowledge you have.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. I really appreciate the time.
Absolutely. And thank you to the audience.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the audience had great questions too. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for being here today. Again, we'll polish this episode, add some additional content to it. It'll become part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast that comes out in 2 weeks from now. So if you want to see any of the past episodes of that show, you can go to transformationgroundcontrol.com and you can see all the past episodes there on whichever platform you prefer to listen or watch. And again, we do these live interviews for that podcast every Tuesday, same time, same place, LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and actually Twitch as well. So be sure to tune in every Tuesday, same time, same place. Hope you all have a great week in the meantime, and we'll see you next week in